That was a better beginning. So much of a better start. It is still great to be here. Remarkable, remarkable campaigns. I'm going to walk through some more examples in a few minutes and how these are happening and the role that media is playing. But I want to step back for a second and start with sort of what we think to be kind of the two historic trends that are intersecting today that are going to define both the present and the future of civic engagement. The first trend we hear about a lot is this sense of disappointment in the inability of everyday people to have voice in their government, the sense of frustration about the lack of our leaders' ability to address the biggest problems of our time. We hear about this all the time. But the second trend is the unique ability for technology to empower people to create change at greater speed and greater scale than ever before. And if you look at the media in general, the media tends to cover the first, this doomsday scenario of sense of disempowerment. But the much more powerful underlying trend, the one that is going to transform, define, we think, not just the next couple decades, but the first half of the 21st century, is the unique ability for technology to democratize democracy, to enable people to participate in ways and a more effectiveness than ever before. That's a fairly big claim we like to make, and I want to identify all the trends that we see that are happening now that illustrate that potential. But to do so, I want to give also some context from how we got to where we're at today. And to do that, I'm going to give a quick personal story. This is where I am from, Santa Barbara, California. It is beautiful. Despite this beauty, all I wanted to do when I grew up was to be an investment banker on Wall Street. That was literally my aspiration from when I was a little kid, because my uncles were all bankers, all the way through until I went to Stanford. And the big shift for me, the transformation in my life, was my senior year at Stanford, and I go home for a break, and I talk to one of my younger brothers, who comes out as gay, completely unexpectedly. And the thing he tells me that is the line that really transformed my life and my trajectory was the things that were most painful for him as a closeted gay American at the time weren't people that were explicitly anti-gay, but those who refused to stand up and to speak out against them. Right? People like me, his own brother. And it was at that point I was, frankly, probably more ashamed than I'd ever been in my life, and for the first time ashamed not at what I had done, but what I had not done. And I started to become obsessed with this idea of, well, how do you get engaged in these issues? And I started reading more about gay rights, and what was not clear to me was how to connect my broad interest in this issue into effective action. And so what I decided to do is I talked to more and more friends, and I found that this was not unique to gay rights. This is general to most issues, this disconnect between awareness, right, oftentimes via the media, and effective action to address those issues. And so for my personal journey, I figured I'd go to the one place in the world where one could really make change. I went to Washington, D.C., which a few years ago you might have sort of forgiven a lot of young, idealistic college students for believing that change was possible. I thought it was. I found I was wrong. I mean, what I really found was the inability of everyday people to have voice in their own government, and what Americans like to think is the world's greatest democracy. There are, I think, many people who would object to that characterization. It certainly didn't look like that to me. And one of the frustrations wasn't just the inability to have voice in DC at the time, but actually the recognition or the failure to recognize how critically important every other issue locally was as well. And in reaction to this, I was thinking about, well, so how does one, this is the early days of social media, 2005, and I run into, for the first time, the Facebook, right, the facebook.com. And I immediately recognized that the same tools that can connect people around friends and around photos can connect them around the issues they care about and mobilize them more rapidly than ever before. That the barriers historically to effective action have been just the costs of organizing, the difficulty and the sort of impediments for people to get together in common cause with one voice, and that social media uniquely addressed this. And so when I was in DC at the time, I was 25, 26, decided to stop doing the work I was doing on specific issues and try to change the structure of power in politics. And we launched the site initially in 2007, and we promptly failed for 4 years. And the reason is that we try to build a set of incredibly complicated tools enabling people to create change. Things like virtual political action committees, crowdfunding at the time, skills-based volunteerism, allow people to blog about issues, all the things you might want to do. What we found is we complicated it and made it too difficult. And what was shocking to me was 4 years in, after battling unsuccessfully, it was a campaign in South Africa that was the actual first illustration to me that the incredible potent power of everyday people who seemingly have no influence, but online can have tremendous, tremendous power. And that is the story of Ufunda. And the story is that about 4 years ago, a friend of hers was walking down the street in Cape Town, South Africa. And she gets grabbed and thrown into a shack and raped and almost killed. And the reason is she's a lesbian woman and the man was trying to turn her straight. It's a heinous act called corrective rape. In South Africa, it happened dozens of times a week. And in reaction to this, this is not new, but she had seen another Changeorg petition in her community before, and she decides she's actually going to take the first stand in her life around an issue like this. Ndume goes to her sister's laptop in the shanty towns in Cape Town. She starts a petition on the site with no network, no connections. And over the next 5 days, she gets 170,000 people from 150 countries. It becomes the biggest story in South Africa that week. It embarrasses the government. She takes then all those people, she drives offline, organizes in front of Parliament, and after several weeks of campaigning, in the context of having the government ignore this issue for decades, they apologize and pass a national task force to investigate and to stop the incidents of corrective rape. Like an incredible illustration of the power of a single voice. At the time, there were many people that thought this was an outlier, this was unique, this was not replicable. But what we decided to do is we saw how Ndume, with the simplest of tools, just a petition tool, was able to be incredibly powerful, much more than the people we had tried to provide tools to before. And so we simplified everything. We put it down to not just desktop but a mobile phone, and letting anyone start a social movement. We have no agenda, no political positions, no party affiliation. It's an open platform like YouTube for anyone to start a campaign. And the reaction to this has been incredible. The first viral campaign right after this happened in the United States. It was from this young woman. The story is Bank of America, the largest bank in America, decides to levy a $5 fee to use your own bank card every month. This is right after making it difficult to change banks by helping to lobby for a law in Congress. Now, there are a lot of consumer groups that were frustrated but didn't have a lot of power. And in reaction to that, she, Molly Catchpool, 22-year-old part-time nanny, starts a petition, gets 300,000 people to join. It becomes a massive national story. She goes offline. She cuts up her credit card in front of all video cameras, all TV cameras. She then gets thousands of other people to do the same. And after a month of campaigning, the largest bank in America turns around 180 degrees, pulls back the fee, loses billions of dollars in potential revenue, and every other major national bank does the same. Incredible consumer power, and this is not just in the US, we start seeing this take off around the world. So the next campaign that I was incredibly inspired by Lakshmi, this is a young woman who at 15 years old in India was proposed to by a man, she said no, and he threw acid on her face to disfigure her so she couldn't get married to anybody else. It's called acid attacks. In India, it happens on a quite regular basis. Now, instead of becoming a recluse, instead of hiding out in her house, she decides, because of her bravery, to fight this. And for years, she tries to get the government office that regulates acid to restrict the sale of the acid most commonly used, and totally ignored. And then we launch a team in India. She starts a petition. Within a week, she gets almost 30,000 signatures. She goes back to the exact same place she was at before, that government office that ignored her previously. She delivers the petition. She has all these cameras around her, the Hindustan Times as well, Times of India, CNN, IBM. And 2 days after that, the government office literally turns around, apologizes, passes a regulation restricting the sale of acid across the entire country and increasing punishments for men that commit this crime. Now, these are pretty remarkable examples, And what's most remarkable is they're not unique. Right? These are the kinds of things that we see happening literally every single day. There are 10,000 victories that have happened around the world that look just like this. About 3 years ago, we saw what was happening, and we decided to expand it in a significant way outside the US. And we built teams in 18 different countries, really the world's biggest democracies in most cases, and hired remarkable entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs that understood online mobilization and offline change. One of those is actually here today, Salvatore, who built Changeorg Italy, and we've hired an amazing team that's been built here. We actually have 3.3 million users in Italy and hundreds of victories, more than 360 victories that have won. And this is now literally happening almost a single victory every hour of every day. So people that criticize, when I still see in the media, people that criticize the idea of slacktivism, I think that you could have been forgiven 5 years ago to still believe that this is just a bunch of fluff, that it wasn't real, that citizens wouldn't have real voice. But anybody really paying attention now, you could not honestly make that assessment. It is literally the case that laws are passing on a daily basis because of what is happening both online and because of online happening offline. And this is what you end up seeing in user growth when you have that number of campaigns, tens and tens of thousands of campaigns. Will be 100 million users in the next few months. But most notably, when you see viral growth like this, it's not going to stop at 100 million. We think that right now, what we have done more than anything has demonstrated that it is actually possible for everyday people to use online tools to rapidly mobilize around any issue and make change. That's the very, very beginning. What's actually most exciting is all of what is to come, is the transformation of hundreds of millions of people, right, winning thousands and thousands of campaigns on a monthly basis or on every major issue, and changing the structure of power so elected officials and companies that are making the decisions that impact our lives increasingly feel the obligation to directly and openly respond to their own constituents. And we're seeing this happen more and more. Now the question is, what is the role of the media in all of this? What have they played so far, and what will the media play in the future? What's noteworthy for all the three campaigns that I mentioned at the beginning, if there were no media coverage, quite literally it's an open question about whether they would have won. Media played a central role in the storytelling that ended up driving those victories. And in Ndume's case, the reason the government really started caring wasn't just the 100,000 plus people that signed the petition, but the media coverage, the international awareness and condemnation because of this. In the case of Bank of America, it was literally the case that Molly Catchpole, that young girl, that young woman, was followed by TV cameras and actually ended up doing a huge piece on Bank of America. It was the case with Lakshmi. She was not by herself when she delivered the petition. She was with 30,000 other people and surrounded by media cameras. And that's an incredibly powerful force. We don't see that incidentally. We literally see 250 media hits every single day on campaigns. A really remarkable amount of coverage. Not writing about Changeorg as an organization, right, but covering these amazing stories that are happening every day. And so your question might be, why is this happening? We get this question a lot from people in the internet space. How the heck is that happening? And the reason isn't because we're interesting. It's because these are just remarkable stories. We're delivering exactly what many journalists are looking for, which is, a lot of these issues, in fact, most of them aren't new. Right? The issue of corrective rape in South Africa, it wasn't discovered by Ufunda. The issue overall of acid attacks in India wasn't unique to Lakshmi. It was just the case that these big, abstract, chronic issues are difficult to cover without a hook, right? Without an individual. When you have it in the abstract, they're just not newsworthy. But if you have a single individual whose voice is amplified by many others, who's an incredibly powerful single story, that story is the kind of thing that we've seen media take and run with. And it is them and the media amplifying the stories that everyday people are starting online that has been this incredible explosion of impact. So even without intending to, regardless of the aspirations of the media covering these stories, simply by virtue of covering what's happening, it's having tremendous impact in the world. The impact, before I go to this, the impact that we're having is the media's coverage doesn't just change people's ability to win the campaigns that they join, but overall, the media's impact on culture, on people's belief of what's possible. One of my favorite campaigns I just was about to show is here in Italy. It's this man, Salvatore, who has ALS, which means he is bedridden, and the only way he can communicate is by blinking his eyes. And so last year, after this ice bucket challenge, as it takes off on Facebook with all these donations you might have seen, Salvatore decides he wants to petition the government of Italy to take much more seriously the issue of the disabled in their own homes and approve €1 billion additional to support that otherwise neglected community. It's a massive amount of support, a tremendous amount of media coverage, and because of that, Renzi writes him a personal note saying he's going to approve €400 million, right, for this very purpose. It's an incredible ability for someone who literally has not just no voice, but cannot speak, cannot move. But because of the power of that personal story, that isn't a new issue. The fact that there are people with substantial disabilities that cannot move their house is not at all unique to this one individual, but it was the unique power of that voice that spread both on social media and on broad media. And the result of all this is just a shifted culture. I think one of the most dangerous things in a democracy is people's sense they can't make a difference, a sense of hopelessness, right? That they're not able to actually have powerful voice, because if that happens, they stop actually trying, and you have fewer and fewer people in public space, and then you cede power and authority to small groups of powerful interests. And so one of our goals, and one of the aspects of impact that media covering these campaigns is having, is breeding a new culture of empowerment, right? Where people that are seeing these examples, instead of reading the newspaper every day and looking in a depressing fashion about all the bad things in the world, it is providing an incredible counter-narrative of how everyday people are raising their voice and having impact like you might never imagine before. What we also end up seeing is, if you look at the trend lines right now, it's not that we're going to just see 1 or 2 or 10 of these campaigns. Literally every major issue that comes up is going to have one of these campaigns, every major topic, and they're going to be ridden with a remarkable number of personal stories. This is going to increasingly become enriching. We work with journalists on a regular basis to help them identify these stories, but it is soon going to be a flood of these personal stories, and for any issue, you're going to be able to identify a compelling protagonist at the forefront of an online movement for offline change. The first thing is sort of the media covering social issues, and by virtue of just covering social issues having impact. The second thing, that we start to see now that we're really excited about is media inspiring change. Now, I know this is a topic of ambivalence amongst many people in the media. There are 2 ways we see this happening. The first is indirectly, right, by covering issues that then inspire people to start campaigns. The second is much more directly, where increasing numbers of people in the media starting campaigns that themselves mobilize readers that have direct impact. The first example, this is one of my favorite examples, Nicole, this young mother in Australia. She has cancer, and because of the regulations for when you can get cancer treatment in Australia, the rarity of her disease prevented her from getting on the list to address her cancer early enough to live, and so she was likely going to die, and this happens to many people, or at least until recently in Australia. And this was covered by the media. The tragedy was covered by the media. But it was a teenage kid who saw this campaign, or saw rather this media interview, and because of it was inspired to start his own petition on Changeorg, mobilized over 100,000 people, and because of his campaign to Parliament on behalf of this woman whose story was covered in the media, right, the government ends up passing a new regulation and committing to changing this, opening up many more hospitals and ensuring that the victims of this cancer would be able to receive treatment before dying. And this is a great, actually the first time they met was on this TV show, The Today Show in Australia. So media, simply by covering things that are important, have the opportunity now to have readers that are consuming that content directly start campaigns to create change. And the second thing we see is media that is more directly embracing the opportunity to have such impact. One of the best examples of this has been with The Guardian, and I think they've done a really remarkable job. So The Guardian had been writing for a period of time about female genital mutilation, right? FGM, the awful practice of female genital cutting. And they've written about it, but this is a very difficult issue. It is uncomfortable, it is abstract for most people, and they don't want to talk about it. And so it was difficult for The Guardian to get a whole lot of attention. And then they connected to this woman, Fama Mohammed, a 17-year-old Somali-born UK citizen who herself also wanted to fight this issue. So she starts a Changeorg petition asking the government of the UK to take action, and she partners with The Guardian. And the results were dramatically different. She gets 200,000 people to join. It is on the cover of The Guardian for 7 different days in a single month. It gets across the UK media. It embarrasses the government. She gets a meeting with the Minister of Education, Michael Gove. She meets him, and 2 days later, he turns around, he changes the policy, he commits to having 100% of teachers across the entire country educated about this issue, requires them to report possible incidences, and takes the first action over more than a decade on this issue in the UK. Literally because this 17-year-old girl, now she could not have done it herself, right? She required the support of The Guardian, but it's the exact same thing. The Guardian itself could not have done this without Fama Mohammed. And what's inspiring is this didn't end here. This is a great article The Guardian had written about her story. They then actually worked with a young woman in the US, you saw in the video, who herself had been caught, who petitioned the US government around creating a study about female genital mutilation. It ends up actually passing as well. And now there's campaigns starting around the world about FGM, in large part because the first action The Guardian took. It is literally potentially the case that The Guardian newspaper will be the most important force over the past decade to help facilitate addressing one of the biggest and worst issues, I think, of mutilation of young girls in this world. An incredible potential impact and really remarkable change. Second example is here. It's Wired here in Italy, which is doing an investigative report about asbestos. Some of you may know that it's thought to be that thousands of people every year potentially have deaths because of this, or at least affected because of this. And they're doing an investigative report around this in a data-driven journalist project. But instead of just writing about the issue, it's a recognition that this is an opportunity to mobilize people on this issue as well. And so enabling readers to join the campaign, asking the Prime Minister to pass or make a commitment to have transparency for how the government is addressing this issue, and creating much more engagement than you otherwise might have. The last example here is one that may be close to some people's hearts. This is the lead Washington Post reporter in Iran who was arrested without any explanation almost a year ago. And his brother, the Washington Post start covering this, his brother starts a petition and gets 300,000 people to join. A huge number of Washington Post reporters sign the petition as well. It mobilizes a tremendous number of the Washington Post readership. And subsequent to that, the National Press Club embraces this. They start promoting it. And now around the world, there are people fighting for the freedom of Jason because of this simple petition started by his brother. Right? And what we end up seeing now is sort of readers as partners with publications. You really now have this incredible dynamic where it's both the case that the public is a source of new stories, is creating and identifying the most powerful stories that media can cover, and that media, when they're writing about stories or thinking about campaigns themselves, can leverage their readership as a means of engaging on that issue, of spreading the story, and then of continuing to get attention. One of the exciting things we see is media getting more and more attention itself because of the campaigns that are inspired by virtue of their work. The last thing I want to sort of close with is there's this sense when people see a lot of Changeorg campaigns that these are many, many small examples of victories, which is absolutely true. Right? And it will still be the case. There'll be many, many, many small wins. But we also start to see some big wins that illustrate the real power of bringing together civil society with technology and media for important change. And there's no better example that I saw when talking to the Italian team than this example that I just think of the Libera, which is Don Ciotti. Many of you might know him, so the priest that is leading this anti-corruption, anti-mafia movement here in Italy, and ended up starting a petition about a year and a half ago, I think it was, and 350,000 people joined this campaign. It was both online and off. It got a tremendous amount of media coverage and support, and in response to this, in April of last year, a new law was passed to increase the penalty and incarceration rates for anybody complicit in trying to buy votes or mafia-related activities around elections. Really, really amazing. And of course, the most powerful thing he talks about is the power of individual voice, the ability, where when you bring together many, many voices, they're so much more powerful than a single individually. And when we look at stepping back the arc that we're on right now and the ultimate impact that we're going to have, both at Changeorg and in general, and using online tools and technology to mobilize people. It's a case that, as individuals, historically, we have very little power. But our power as individuals is not in working alone. It's in mobilizing like-minded people to come together to make change, and we are in a better position than ever before to make this happen, and I cannot wait to see what is next and the role that the media has in amplifying and accelerating that. So I'll stop there and would love to hear anybody's questions. Thank you. So I think we have microphones. I'm happy to answer any questions. I also love direct, brutally honest questions, so do not hesitate in any way.
Hi, could you explain the difference between you and Avaz? I don't get it properly.
Yeah. So we are a technology platform that empowers people to create campaigns around any issue they care about. There are 20,000 new petitions on every range of issues, on many different political topics, started by individuals on our site. We never start campaigns ourselves. We're not a political organization. There is a huge ecosystem of political organizations, such as Avaz, that have specific campaigns they're running themselves. Sometimes it's 1 a year, sometimes it's 5 a year. Avaz runs, let's say, 3 or 4 campaigns every single month. So it's a platform using technology to empower anyone to create tens of thousands of campaigns versus an issue advocacy organization running a few specific campaigns. Part of the confusion about us as a platform in general is if you look at some NGO websites, you see a list of campaigns. You look on Changeorg's website, you also see a list of campaigns. Of course, the difference is we don't see is there's thousands and thousands of times more campaigns, and they're all started by individuals, not by the organization itself. But that's why there has been some confusion in the past.
Hi there. You said before that you don't have Changeorg is an independent, not affiliated to any political party or anything. So any campaign can be raised by Changeorg. What happens if you have, for example, 2 different campaigns that go in the opposite direction just say, for example, on the LGBT issues, so anti-gay rights and gay rights? Did you ever experience something like that, and how do you?
Yeah, we experience competing petitions on a pretty regular basis, and we, as an open platform, allow both of those or any number of those to reside on the site. Look, if there's other campaigns that are hateful or violent or bullying, it may violate our terms of service, but that's quite rare. In the majority of cases, it's an open platform, and we empower citizens to express voice on either side or any perspective, and in general, we tend to see one of the petitions will take off more than others.
I'm wondering if you have any data on information statistics about how the success of petition depends or corresponds with the type of regime in the country. For example, authoritarian regimes like in Russia, for example, how does it correspond with that?
So we have staff in 18 countries. People can start and join campaigns in any country. We have users, members in 196 countries. Things have been most focused when we hire local staff that end up connecting to citizens, to media, to government and whatnot. And in general, the countries we have staff in are countries that have broadly free speech. What we do find in those countries is that the increasing disaffection of people, the sort of sense of frustration, also tends to drive more and more action. So places where there's a sense that the political environment is not serving the needs of the people, it ends up inspiring more people to go around the system using tools like Changeorg to go raise their voice. I'll specifically address, in the issue of Russia, we actually have a presence in Russia and about 4 million users in Russia, kind of exceptional in many more campaigns and actually victories than people would expect. Not so much at the national level, but oftentimes at local level for government and multinational corporations.
I just wondered, how do you make revenue? How do you make money? I don't know if you're advertising or...
Yeah, I'll address that first. Actually, to first step back and say, we are what's called in the United States a B corporation, so a hybrid between sort of a traditional nonprofit and a traditional company. So we're not a nonprofit, we're a social enterprise. And the reason for that is because if you care about scaled social change using technology, being able to be as sort of innovative and rapidly growing as possible, it's actually much easier to scale that as a company, as a benefit corporation, than as a traditional nonprofit. And so what we decided to in 2007, we actually started as a nonprofit before, and we incorporated it as a company because of the need to be able to build out the technology that could get hundreds of millions of users. And so the business model that we have is that we, just in the same way that Google has sponsored links or Facebook has sponsored posts, we have sponsored petitions. So anyone can start a petition for free, about 20,000, as I mentioned, a month, and then organizations, oftentimes the biggest NGOs, UNICEF or Oxfam or Action Against Hunger, can sponsor their petition and promote it to people that care about their issue to be able to grow their own movement, their donor bases and whatnot. And so I think that the best business models are ones in which you have alignment between making revenue and actually making impact. And our business model is building the membership and the movements of a lot of these organizations through that advertising.
I had one question, but one other question prompted a second, if you'll allow me. Firstly, just to go back to the question about the opposing campaigns running, there seems to be a presupposition that all change is good, but all change isn't good. What if the National Rifle Association gets onto change.org and starts to campaign for its issues and succeeds? Is that registered as a victory? And my second question simply is, you say that you're trying to change the structure of power. One could say that what you're dealing is with the symptoms of power, that are the poor symptoms of power that's not used in the right way. But explain to me, I mean, you're mopping up a lot of things and changing things in a reactive way, but how can you switch to a proactive way to get to the systemic issues which are at the bottom of the structure of power?
Yeah. So in the first question about sort of, is all change good? So if you look at, what we don't do is we don't make an assessment of the effectiveness of the organization based on the benefits of any one specific campaign, right? There are going to be hundreds of thousands of these. What we do is you step back and you look in the sort of the past 100 years in particular, and mostly sort of in Western countries, there's been a radical increase in basic fairness and justice and equality. I think it's widely acknowledged if you look at the rights that most people had 100 plus years ago. And the reason for that is in large part a greater and greater number of people becoming empowered to have their own voice heard in public space, in the civic square. Sort of minorities becoming empowered to have that. I think the biggest problem we face is not left versus right, but it's actually top versus bottom, small groups of people that have had that power. And what we're doing is we're accelerating that. We are coming to its natural conclusion, which is everyday people and everyone having equal voice in the institutions that impact their lives. Now that doesn't mean in each case then the specific things that they start are going to be good or by anyone's individual definition. But the aggregate impact of a system that is largely determined not by a small number of people, but the vast majority of the public, that is a process we think is much healthier outcomes for the world. So rather than sort of define ourselves based on any individual issue, we think more about how do you change the structure of how decisions are made, which gets to your second question, which is right now people are largely reacting to these issues. What's interesting is when you look at early days of sort of any movement, right now we have on the one hand 100 million users seems like it's going to be a tremendous amount, but it's actually only the beginning. What we want to do is to change structural incentives for elected officials and for companies so that before they make any decision, when they're making decisions to begin with, right, they have different incentives. If you have half the voting public that is petitioning you, that is going to know what policy you advance, is going to know not just when you make that decision, but also when you go into the voting booth and you make your voting decisions, that information is going to be transparent, that I'm going to be able to see the decisions my elected officials made, right? How that is perceived against my values, and who I might want to vote for because of that. When all this ends up being accelerated substantially, you start changing the incentives of elected officials and companies who preemptively change their behavior. One of the notable things on sort of this issue of banking in the United States for Bank of America, it was quite funny because I got a question from the Journal after that campaign that said, do you think, this is the campaign with Molly Catchpole, that now every major policy for a bank is going to result in a Changeorg petition? And I said no, because I think banks will have fewer silly policies that are clearly against the interests of their consumers. And having spoken to heads of many banks, it's very clear they now realize that when they're in a boardroom making a decision about the impact of their policies, they now recognize two things. One is full transparency. Everyone is going to know the consequences of the decisions they make. And second, accountability. They know there will be a Changeorg campaign that will require them to justify that decision to their sons and to their daughters. And that is a very different way in which they have to make decisions.
What's left when a campaign doesn't succeed?
So when campaigns, the majority of campaigns that do not succeed are campaigns where the petition creator does not mobilize a critical mass of people. Sometimes it's because they're sort of committed but not fully committed because they're quite busy. Sometimes it doesn't resonate with a large enough group of people, partly because maybe most people disagree with it. And in campaigns that get thousands of signatures and do not succeed, one of two things might happen. One might be, look, not all change is good. It may be the case that the elected official who's being petitioned responds or says, look, this is not representative of the desires of the majority of the people. It's fine for you to petition, and I see you, I hear you, but I disagree. Or the second, sometimes, is that even it doesn't change that particular policy, it changes the framework of decision making. I'll give you a quick example. There's a campaign you may have remembered around Boko Haram, so this campaign around Bring Back Our Girls earlier this last year. 200 young Nigerian schoolgirls that were kidnapped, and there was a huge amount of international outcry, a lot of social media exposure, and then it didn't win. Right? There's a petition on Changeorg started by a Nigerian schoolgirl who's studying in Germany, got 1 million signatures. It helped drive this huge hashtag Bring Back Our Girls on Twitter, was signed by all these celebrities, and ended up actually not getting the girls back. You might think, well, that's just a total failure. But we would not be talking about Boko Haram at all as an organization. It would not have a brand in any way. It would not be condemned internationally as significantly in anywhere near the case as it is now if it were not for that social media campaign on Changeorg and Twitter. So it was definitely not perfect, but at that time, there's literally, sort of without naming names, there was a former head of state who's in Nigeria at the time who called me to ask because the petition on Changeorg had been shut down because the woman, the Nigerian schoolgirl who started it, was afraid for her family's own safety after getting 1 million signatures. It was shut down. He called me to ask me to see if we can get it opened back up because he said, look, this is going to sound crazy, but the single most important force that is embarrassing right now the Nigerian and American governments is the petition on Change.org and the hashtag on Twitter, literally. Right? These things actually are of consequence. So it didn't win, but it definitely changed the narrative, and overall now changed the way in which governments are going to have to address that as a terrorist group.
I have a question. How do you see the social media campaign influencing in building consumers' trust, consumer or users' trust, and do you see any constraints in it? And what's the future of this, especially being launched through Facebook?
In building consumers' trust? I think what's interesting now is we see increasingly, talking about structures, increasingly the companies that are authentic, the companies that have brands that seem honest to people, increasingly are doing better and better. Most products, consumer products, certainly, a lot of the value of the company is their brand. Right? And brand is sort of this sort of ephemeral thing, but increasingly brand is being defined not by the company, right, but by people, consumers, oftentimes via social media, which is, it puts consumers in an incredibly powerful position. And so what I think is exciting is you see this tremendous amount on Facebook, on Twitter, on Change.org, so people that are mobilizing to ask companies to behave better and behave different, and that by itself is actually giving new incentives to companies. It's helping companies that are doing well succeed, and those that are actually inauthentic or those that are undermining the public good are increasingly under attack, under siege. There's one campaign, SeaWorld, this last year. It's unfortunately an American example, but the SeaWorld example is, it's a company that has a bunch of animals, so wildlife that are sort of in cages that do a lot of, effectively a lot of young kids will go to see. And there's been a historic critique of SeaWorld as a company because of the way they treat their animals. But they've largely ignored this. So what happens in response is somebody decides to start a petition, ends up resulting in tons of petitions that end up getting a huge number of people around SeaWorld to pull out support from SeaWorld, to stop doing concerts at SeaWorld, to stop partnerships at SeaWorld. And a few months after that happens, SeaWorld stock reduces by 30% in a single day. It goes down almost 50% in a single year, in large part because the campaigns on Changeorg highlighted, illuminated this problem that had always existed before, that frustrated consumers who couldn't connect easily, who now, because of petitions spread through social media, had more power than before. And I think it's a really big wake-up call for SeaWorld and for companies that are doing practices that are against the public interest, where now the public can easily mobilize, find each other, and really impact the brand. Done? Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And if you have any questions at all, Luca's here.
Born from a love of reading,